comedy is tricky. It can be a difficult subject matter to break down, and that's because it's so subjective. There don't really seem to be any exact or specific techniques that you can use to make a joke, and if you did, it'd probably feel artificial and wouldn't actually be funny. Writing comedy is mostly a process that's based on instinct. However, there are still techniques that you can use to write comedy, and a great example of how to do this is in Kaguya-sama: Love is War. How do you write a comedy? Now you may be saying, Brandon, that's obvious. All you need to do is think of as many jokes as you can and put it into the story. But I disagree. Sure, that is one way that you can write comedies, and there are many movies and anime that do just that. But usually the idea of writing lots of jokes and putting into the plot only works with stories that aren't actually comedies. Let me explain. Every time a story stops to make a joke, the plot has to stop. And that's completely fine with stories that aren't comedies, since the jokes only happen sometimes. And after the joke is finished, the story can now continue. This works well so long as the writer knows when it's the right time to make these jokes. But a comedy needs to have lots of jokes. Lots. And if you write an entire comedy with this approach, the writer will begin to burn themselves out. You need to keep thinking of more and more jokes that are basically irrelevant to the plot. And in order to make these jokes, you're constantly stopping and stopping and stopping things in order to make them. Now, I'm not saying this approach can't still work, but I do think there are more effective ways of writing comedy. There is a method that all great comedies use, Kaguya-sama included. A method that, in my opinion, works much better. The jokes come more naturally, everything flows better, and it feels more relevant without interrupting things. In Kaguya-sama, the plot is a joke. In a good way. This is what I believe separates a story with jokes in them and a true comedy. In a true comedy, the jokes aren't these isolated things that exist in between the plot, but are instead the plot in itself. You should be able to summarize the events that happen and it would still be funny, or at the very least still be able to see what the joke actually is. So for example, let's go back to one of the scenes in the very first episode. On a rainy day, both Shinomiya and Shirogane need to walk home. Both of them want to share an umbrella, but they're too prideful to admit it, since offering to share an umbrella is somehow a confession of love. They both check at the same time, and it turns out they've both forgotten their umbrellas. Shirogane forgot to check the weather forecast, and Shinomiya usually gets picked up. But they were both bluffing. In their bags, they both have an umbrella, and they lied at the same time. But neither of them can take it out now, because that would expose their intentions, showing how they were both embarrassed to invite the other person underneath their umbrella. Now they need to try and expose the other person's lie. Shirogane strikes first. It's strange that Shinomiya would have a flat tire that day, and yet she, someone who always plans ahead on the day it rains, happened to not have an umbrella. But then Shinomiya strikes back. It was strange that Shirogane always rides a bike, and yet it just so happened on the day that there was a storm he didn't check the weather forecast. And even more suspiciously, his bike wasn't in the bike racks that day, meaning that he took the train that day. But why would he take the train that day if he didn't check the weather forecast? It is revealed that Kaguya not only confirmed the weather report and carefully looked at the weather map and used an awl to pierce the tire of her car, but also checked the bike racks to see if Shirogane's bike was there. Checkmate. Kaguya is on the verge of exposing Shirogane, but then Chika comes in and ruins everything. She comes in, gives Kaguya an umbrella, and runs off gleefully. Great. Now after all that, they have an umbrella and don't know what to do. Kaguya tries giving it to Shirogane, and so he borrows half of it, and they both walk home together. Battle result, a tie. Now, I'm not going to go through that entire scene and explain why each beat is funny, because A, that's a huge pain, and B, that would just ruin the joke. But even just after reading the summary for that, I still think it works. And this isn't even one of the funniest episodes. I just chose this one specifically because it's easy to understand without context. I can still clearly see what the joke is, and I can still understand why it would be funny. And this is because the way the comedy was written was by making the jokes the plot in itself. You summarize it, and you still get the joke. It still has a plot in the traditional sense where a character wants something, they make decisions to go get it, complications arise, there's a resolution, yada yada yada. But the point here is that the details are what's funny. It is literally ingrained into the story. You'll also see that there's a lot of other great comedies that do the exact same thing. Konosuba, Nichijou, One Punch Man, Mob Psycho, and while I haven't seen them yet, I'm willing to bet Gintama and Grand Blue do the exact same thing. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Brandon, you may say, What about things like good direction, dialogue, music, voice acting, and comedic timing? Aren't those important too? And yes, those are very important. These are the execution that determines whether a joke lands or fails. When done well, they can make a good joke even better. And when done poorly, they can ruin what could have been a great joke. In Kaguya-sama, these things are done so well and make everything so much funnier. Having big sweeping camera moves, with the huge, epic, over-the-top orchestral music, and the voice actors delivering their lines perfectly, and the spot-on comedic timing make watching this absolutely hilarious. However, you can have the greatest direction, dialogue, music, voice actors, and comedic timing in the world, but if the joke sucks, then the joke sucks. And if there is no real joke in the first place and you just try to act like there is, then it's not going to be funny no matter how well you frame it. Unless it's like an anti-joke or something, but that's a completely different category. The idea behind the joke is like the foundation, while the delivery of that joke determines how well that joke is going to be told. And yeah, maybe I'm wrong, maybe there are exceptions to this, but so far I haven't really seen anything that proves this theory otherwise just yet. However, there is something that I failed to answer throughout this entire video, something that is probably the most important part of writing comedy in the first place. And that is, how do you think of a good joke in the first place? And the answer is instinct. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry, that is not helpful at all, but jokes can't be made artificially. You just gotta think, it'd be pretty funny if this happened, and then you write that. That's all there really is to it. If you try and break things down beyond that, you're just not having fun writing jokes in the first place. So long as you thought it was funny the first time you thought of it, then it should work. Just go for it. So to summarize, the way Kaguya-sama creates comedy is through its plot. And while inserting jokes in between the plot is an effective way of writing comedy sometimes, for stories that are primarily comedies, it is usually best to stick to creating comedy through the plot. A good way to check this is by summarizing the events that happen and seeing if the joke is still there. But overall, in order to think of a joke in the first place, you need to rely on instinct and think of what would be funny if it happened, and then doing that. This, I believe, is why Kaguya-sama works. And it is also what I believe to be the best way of writing comedy. But, you want to know what would also be the best? If you give this video a like, it makes a huge difference and it helps out the channel a lot. I really appreciate it. And if you want, maybe check out some of my other content as well. My name is Brendan Riley, and that is how Kaguya-sama creates comedy. I just dropped my phone.